Just because, in ancient cities, they were built sort of very compactly in a very sort of tight space. The streets were very narrow and things. You had your sort of housing area there, and you would get to the gate, and the gate would be maybe the one place within the city where you'd actually have an open sort of space, where there'd be not only just the sort of gate there, but you'd also have benches sort of around it. And it would be almost like a sort of a more modern sort of town square or plaza. It would serve as a sort of civic center, as well as also being a kind of marketplace area. So it makes sense for Boaz to go up there and to try to find this redeemer. There's no sort of aimless wandering. He figures at some point or other, sooner rather than later, he's going to see this man and be able to settle matter. And then look at how he commands this situation here in verse 1 there. He says, "Turn aside, friend. Sit down here." And he turned aside and sat. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Look at Boaz's strength of character. He simply asks these men to do this, and they do it. There's something about him that carries this sort of respect. He doesn't have to demand. He doesn't have to demean anybody. He doesn't have to dramatize the situation. He simply just has to ask, "Will you come over here and sit down with me? I have something to talk to you about," and they'll do it. And there's something that the author's setting up for us here in the way that Boaz handles this deal and the way that he puts it across, in that on the one hand, seems casual, and yet on the other, he's very much in business mode too. He's going to get the deal done today. And as we've seen so often before in the book, verse 1 here, we're told, "Behold, the Redeemer came by." And much like, as it told us earlier in chapter 2, that as luck would have it, Ruth ended up in the field of Boaz. As luck would have it, the Redeemer comes by just at that time. And we see once again God's hand at work in all of this. And look at now how Boaz presents this to the Redeemer. Verse 3 here, it says, "Naomi is selling a parcel of land." Now this is a twist. We've not heard about this land to this point. Actually, all we know about Naomi and Ruth is that they're facing extreme poverty before receiving the help from Boaz. So what's going on here now? There's mention of some land. Could she not have sort of sold this off before? Well, it may well be that actually Numbers 27, you sort of hear some rules about land inheritance, things that actually a widow without a heir might not have necessarily been able to inherit the land for herself, since, in that culture, the line of the family goes through the men. Or it may simply have been a more practical economic thing, that although they have this piece of land, it takes money to sustain it and to make anything from it. And it may simply have been easier for Naomi to have left the land than to try to do something with it. Sometimes there can be a piece of property like that, can't there? Where, actually, it's more of a liability than an asset for me. It's taking more money for me to keep it going and not falling into than it's really worth for me to have anything to do with it. But either way, one commentator here says it seems likely that the property was but a counter in the game, and that Boaz used it to his own end. Boaz introduces the deal, firstly, not with Ruth, which actually has been the whole discussion in chapter 3, wasn't it? It was of Ruth proposing to Boaz. Actually, he's beginning with the piece of land and Naomi. It's an approach that will perhaps only make sense when we see the results. It goes on to tell us here, Boaz speaks of his motive here. He says, "I thought that I would tell you and ask you to buy this piece of land in the presence of the elders." Again, there's this casual tone in a way, but also notice what Boaz is doing. He's putting it across in a casual way. He's seemingly at least trying to give off the impression that maybe he's not that interested. He's just heard of this. "Oh, I thought I should let you know." But he is forcing the other Redeemer to make a decision publicly in a legally binding way. Boaz is very clever He's maybe crafty in what he does. He's pushing him into a corner that one way or other, he's going to have to make a decision. And exactly what he's promised to Ruth is that one way or other, either I or the other Redeemer is going to redeem you, but somebody will. So he says, I thought I would tell you, and if you will not, then you should tell me, because I'm the next in line and there's nobody else to redeem her. He doesn't seem all that interested, and yet I think he very much is. I think he's intentionally taking a bargaining position, isn't he? There's a great quote here in Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen. You didn't think I could do that, I bet. That wasn't sort of my thing, but every now and again. It says, I've had to appear indifferent where I've been most deeply interested. Sorry, my writing is difficult to read. I've had to appear indifferent where I've been most deeply interested. And I think that's very much what Boaz is doing. He's giving off the impression that he's not all that interested, really. This is just an administrative decision that will out. But I think that covers over actually a great wealth of feelings with which he just doesn't want to reveal, lest it might actually encourage the other Redeemer to be more interested. And so now we get this really big twist here where we think everything is really going downhill fast here. The Redeemer says, verse 4 here, I will redeem it. Notice the language there, I will redeem it. He's not even thinking of Naomi or of Ruth at this point. He's thinking purely of the field. Not to be encouraged, not to be commended, but to be observed. That for the other Redeemer, all he sees is the piece of land. That's all he's really interested in at all. Why is he interested? Well, from the Redeemer's point of view, this is really a pretty good deal for him. He can get another piece of land to add to his inheritance for his children. So on the one hand, as far as he knows at the minute, he'll have to support Naomi with some of the proceeds from that land. But to be really pragmatic about it, that's probably not going to be for much longer since she's older. And since she's not of a childbearing age, Naomi's told us that at the beginning of the book, that she says, you shouldn't wait around for me, Ruth and Orpah, because even if I were to, I'm not of childbearing age, but even if I were to, would you really be able to wait until they'd grown up that you could marry them? Since she's not of childbearing age, there's no chance of further children coming in and the Redeemer having to support them sort of financially with, I guess, a form of sort of child maintenance, but then also diluting his inheritance to cut them into it as well. This is a deal that makes a lot of sense for the Redeemer. If anything, sort of into the long term, this offers him a lot back. And so he's all too willing to say, well, yes, I will redeem it. And we think, as readers who've had all the stories so far, no, this was not how it was supposed to end. But now Boaz throws a twist in for the Redeemer. Having now agreed to a redemption, Boaz says, well, in the day of which you buy the field, you also acquire Ruth to perpetuate the name of the dead. Boaz is doing something really clever here, because what he's doing is saying is, no, you must do both. You cannot just take the land and have that and enjoy that. You either step in and you're a proper redeemer, and you redeem the field and you redeem Naomi, but you also redeem Ruth. Or you do nothing at all. But what you don't do is get to just siphon off the land and the money from that and then ignore the rest of your responsibilities. Boaz has played his hand really carefully here. And he's backed the other Redeemer into a corner of which actually he's almost certainly not going to be able to say yes to, because he would like to take that deal himself. But look already at some of the contrasts between Boaz and this other, at this point, nameless Redeemer. The other Redeemer is only interested so long as there's an opportunity for him, so long as the deal sort of works well for him. The other Redeemer isn't interested if it comes down in any sort of way to taking on any further responsibilities. He's not at all interested in that. Boaz, however, is interested despite this quite obviously being something of a disruption and a cost to himself. Far from running from the responsibilities, he embraces taking responsibility for both Ruth and Naomi. And so let that serve as a sort of example of the kind of man that men we ought to be seeking to be. But also for women, the kind of man that is worthy of your attention and your affection. You'll find many, many boys who are interested so long as everything is fun and everything is responsibility free. You will find less who are willing to actually embrace responsibility. And yet those are exactly the kind of people who are worthy of that attention. It feels at this point, maybe, is all that Ruth can hope for here just this marriage of cold convenience. And we wonder what Boaz is doing exactly and is negotiating here. Well, let me give you just a few things that I think Boaz is doing here, because it seems strange. It seems as if maybe he's lost some interest, but I don't think he has at all. Firstly, he's following the social convention. He's said it before, the narrator has said it, that he doesn't have the first right of redemption. Actually, within his clan, he isn't the one who has the first say in what happens here. And so he has to give the other guy the first say if he's going to respect the way in which his culture operates. Secondly, he's keeping his word. This is exactly what he said he would do. He said to Ruth, there's another redeemer closer than I. If he won't redeem you, then I will. He's keeping his word at giving that redeemer the first chance to keep up his responsibilities. Thirdly, he's put over this whole thing in such a way that he's respected the kinsman, he's respected his position, he's respected the fact that he's got the first rights to make a say here. He's allowed him to have those rights. He's forced a decision. But he's also rather cleverly managed to avoid the suspicion of his and Ruth's prior relationship. We spoke in chapter 3 about actually the way in which I don't think that they do anything wrong, but you can imagine if they related the story to people of what had happened, that people would perhaps put their own interpretation on it and might have thought that something untowards had gone on. But actually, Boaz is rather skillfully actually deflected from any conversation about that or any suggestion about their ongoing and prior relationship. And he's also avoided any sort of claims into the future that Boaz married Ruth because he saw the opportunity of an asset in the land that Naomi had claim to. Because actually we see here that it's probably more a liability than an asset to anyone who takes it on because of the commitment to keep the name going of Elimelech. Fourthly, he's also put it across in such a way that initially the Redeemer's interested, but ultimately he's not going to be interested, so that he would not take up those rights. I think Boaz has set out deliberately, framing this in such a way that he would not take up the rights, because he was desperate to take up the rights. But he had to respect his position that he has the first opportunity at it. But he's put it across in a skillful way in which he knows that at the end of it, he's going to get what he really wants. And he's sort of bluffed him by making it look like he was really not so interested in it after all. And yet maybe most of all, he's simply doing the right thing. This is what was expected. This is what he said he would do. And even though actually this risks him not getting what he wanted at the end of it, he's doing the right thing. And maybe that might be the thing of all others to take from Boaz, is that he's an example of doing the right thing, even when that might really cost. And that might mean that we don't get what we want. We're to do the right thing. Secondly, here we see a love beyond law. Look with me there to the to verses 6 to 12 there. In chapter 1, we'd heard of Orpah and Ruth, Naomi's two daughters-in-laws there, real faithful love and commitment to Naomi, that they had stayed with her. And the story was not condemning Orpah for her eventually walking away. Naomi had given her multiple opportunities to do that and said, no, please do. Please go and find a new life somewhere else. I don't want you to lose your life staying with me. Go and find a new future for yourself. But the contrast was the exceptional, the extraordinary kind of loving commitment of Ruth that still wouldn't leave Naomi, even when given the chance to. And now here we're going to see this contrast between this one nameless Redeemer and Boaz. Boaz's love and commitment toward Ruth is just extraordinary and exceptional in comparison to this Redeemer who is called here. Literally, if you look back a few verses, Boaz refers to me, turn aside, friend, sit down here. The English there is very kind to the Redeemer, because actually it literally means so-and-so. And it's a weird, that's why sometimes it's put as friend, is it's weird to translate it like that, because you and I know that we would never in conversation with one another call them so-and-so. We would only do that if we were talking about you with somebody else. We'd, oh, you know, so-and-so, you know, what's his name? Oh, your man, if you're from Northern Ireland, or, you know, that wee fella. You know, you wouldn't do it to their face, or well, maybe you would, maybe you're not friends. So there's this strange kind of thing with the language, but even that is supposed to say something different between Boaz and this man simply known as so-and-so. He says now, verse 6, I can't redeem it. Notice again that language there, it. I can't redeem it. That is the field. He's still only talking about the land and not Ruth. I can't redeem it for myself. Again, it might be worth just sort of circling that. I can't redeem it, that is the field, for myself. Isn't the whole idea of the redemption not for him, but for Naomi and for Ruth? Again, it's not commending it, it's just recording it as how it happened. I can't redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. And actually the word there is more ruin. Lest I ruin my own inheritance. That is, that I wind up in the end having to provide for more and more sort of heirs and descendants. And what happens is my own inheritance for my kids just get more and more diluted as more and more people get factored into it. And the question that's really being asked to the characters here is, well, what are you willing to lose for her? What are you willing to give for her? We see that love really is measured by commitment. It's measured by that willingness to give, to sacrifice for one another, but especially upon the man. I wondered sort of whether or not really to go into this sort of tangent, but I think I will at least sort of in part, because I think it's important. And I just think more and more and more this is happening in culture in which a sort of sense of a distinction of relationship and distinction of marriage is lost. And especially this upon men. This is from Ephesians 5 here. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body and is himself its Saviour. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ in the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. This is a very distinct picture of loving relationships. And that's where marriage is something entirely different to the culture's sort of picture and projection of every other sort of thing that it wants to call loving relationships. This is something entirely different, a level of commitment and sacrifice that is unprecedented, where it becomes, and hopefully you may have noticed there, even just in those verses, that there is a significant change of identity that happens that drives that behavior, that life. You see that a man leaves home, he's now left one identity. Your primary and your core identity is not now in respecting and following your parents, but is now to leave home, to find independence, to now cling to your wife, and now the primary commitment is there now to one another. And that it then does something different again because it changes your identity to a new third thing. Do you see that? That you become one flesh, that now you are a new identity there together. You've now both left one thing there behind. You still love and respect your family, of course, but you've left home now. You're now your own family. And now this commitment to one another, to this new identity that's been forged here, is the thing that ought to drive everything. And you see it not on display in the one Redeemer, and you see it on display with Boaz. You see it not on display with this other Redeemer who simply says, I can't redeem this for myself. Not willing to take on that new commitment, that new responsibility, that new identity. And yet, on the other hand, you'll see Boaz who responds markedly differently to that. Look at those contrasts again between the other Redeemer, literally referred to as so-and-so, what's his name, your man, the wee fella, so concerned for his name in all this. I can't do this because of what this will do to my family name and to my inheritance. He didn't do the right thing. And he didn't follow the responsibility really he'd been given. And yet, in so doing, he loses his name in the story. He's simply now forever known as so-and-so. And perhaps that's the author being rather kind and sort of sparing some embarrassment. For if he was named, surely we would look down on him, wouldn't we? And think, oh, what a poor job he really did. Or perhaps it's a judgment to completely lose your name, to be known forever as so-and-so. And yet Boaz risks his name being forgotten. Do you see that? That he says, in the day of which you buy the land, you also have to marry Ruth for the purpose of perpetuating the name of the dead. You have to marry Ruth in order to be able to give her at least one son who will carry on the line of Elimelech. Your job will be to carry on the line of the dead. And in so doing, Boaz risks that maybe his own name would die out instead, as he keeps Elimelech's name going. And yet, Boaz's name endures. It's a reminder for us not to live, not to work, to build up your own name, lest you risk losing it entirely. The odd thing is that even for the way in which so-and-so handles this, I think the honest truth is that in our culture, he can often actually come across as the stronger, the more responsible one, the more prudent one. He's the one who's working to make sure that his own inheritance doesn't get spoilt. Isn't there something responsible about that? And Boaz perhaps comes across as being slightly more weak and lonely and naive and rash, that he's sort of rushed in to this thing perhaps without thinking about the future. The Redeemer tells me to take my right of redemption. And in fact, that had been the goal all along, I think, for Boaz, was to secure the right of redemption so that he could marry Ruth. And Boaz has publicly and legally secured this now to do this legitimately. Now, that is important. You might think that's a it's a sort of less important sort of detail, but actually it's important when you think back to chapter 1 and to what Ruth had asked of Naomi, the promise that she had given. She had said, I want your God to be my God. I want your people to be my people. Where you go, I will go. And where you die, I want to be buried there too. She was saying she wanted to become a citizen of the people of God. It's really important that Boaz has enabled for this marriage to happen legitimately, legally, because now in every sense, Ruth will be a true citizen with all the rights of citizenship as a result. This is masterful from Boaz. He's drawn in the Redeemer. He's downplayed the role of Ruth there, just bringing her in at the end there. He started with the field, gaining his interest, and then he's made sure that he'll lose the interest by increasing the responsibilities that he'll have to take up. If the Godfather from the film, makes people an offer they can't refuse, Boaz has done the reverse. He's made an offer he knows he'll refuse because he wants to marry Ruth himself. It's been masterful. And then we get this sort of commentary on the legal process and the public witness to it, where the exchange of the sandal just sort of ratifies the deal. And it tells us something simple, just in that the author expects that we may be reading this not knowing about this. Expects that this story might be being read by people who are not Jewish and don't understand those customs. But we see something interesting here again as well, that marriage is a public and a community act. The community are stakeholders in this. It's not a private, it's not a personal act. That's a way in which marriage is greatly misunderstood today, that it's a private and it's a personal thing, and that even all the decision-making and everything about it is all a deeply personal and intimate thing, and the community should have no involvement in it. As you know, marriage is a public act, and it affects the community. It affects our families, our friends, and those around us, doesn't it? Who we wind up marrying, and the sort of health and vitality of that relationship, it affects everyone. That's a big difference to today, where I think it's seen as an intensely personal and private thing. We're saying right sort of at the beginning of the series, that contrast between the way that you see the story of Titanic, whether you either see it as this great sort of story of the triumph of sort of personal sort of love in the West, or whether actually you read it in a more collectivist society and say, do you know, actually, maybe there was something a little bit selfish about that, she could have redeemed her family if she had married the guy that was arranged, and could have redeemed the whole family from shame. Marriage is a public thing. Ruth has appealed to join the people of God in chapter 1, verse 16, and now the crowd gives two types of blessing here that sort of show her citizenship. They ask it that the woman would be made like Rachel and Leah, the mothers of the 12 tribes with Jacob, and mothers of the nation, therefore. They also ask that she would be like Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, the child she bears, that is. And in much the same way, you can read in the story of Tamar that a family is saved and then eventually blessed and grows by the actions of a faithful foreign widow. Ruth's not just becoming part of the people of God, she's becoming an absolutely central part in the redemption of God's people. Thirdly, we see here they're saved through a son. It says, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and that the Lord gave her conception and she bore a son. This is the ending we know to be the right one. And surely as we've read along, you've longed for at the end. And yet we see here, even in this most ordinary, most natural thing of childbirth itself, that even that is the work of God's gracious and mysterious providence. We've seen him at work over everything. And that's not always been easy, has it? There's a lot of things that happen to the characters here that aren't easy. And yet still somehow, mysteriously, God's hand is over them and he works his purposes through them, and his redemption comes the other side of them. But even in childbirth, God's hand is in it, that the Lord gave her conception. That's important, that childbirth is not a right owed to us. It is not a right owed to us to extract and exact autonomy over. It's a sovereign gift from the hand of God. The women said, "Blessed be the Lord, who hasn't left you this day without a redeemer, and that you may your name be renowned." Naomi had returned to Bethlehem, saying to her friends and to the community there, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Lord has dealt with me bitterly." And now we see this great reversal. She had come back home saying how God had dealt with her bitterly. And now the crowd tell Naomi, no, he hasn't. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't left you without a redeemer. May his name be renowned. He will be to you a restorer of life and the nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to a son. The love of Ruth, more than just sort of the customs, the laws, the expectations upon the redeemers, the love of Ruth will drive her to make sure that this son looks after Naomi to the end of her days. And yet there's even more for Naomi here. It says verse 16 here, Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. In effect, one commentator says that she sort of becomes his foster mother. For all sort of intents and purposes, she's as good as a mother to the child. One of the tensions of talking about childbirth there in verse 13, saying that that's actually in God's hands, one of the tensions of that, is it not, is what if, for whatever reason, it doesn't happen for you? Or what if, as many people experience, you experience the loss of a child at whatever stage that may be? And then how do you answer that? It's incredibly difficult, isn't it? To then think that, God is in charge of that. And yet we see on the other hand here, he's someone for whom has lost 2 children in tragic circumstances here. We see the beauty and the value and the dignity and the significance here of alternative pathways to parenting. Naomi wasn't at the age where that was going to happen for her naturally, but had lost, amongst other things, amongst losing her husband and losing the life that they had together, had lost the whole thing of being a mother to her sons. A tragic thing. And yet now look at this redemption here for her, that Naomi becomes a mother again for Obed. That place and that role of motherhood has been restored in perhaps an unexpected and an unlikely way. But she's no less a mother. She's no less blessed for not having birthed Obed. And as far as the community is concerned, as far as her friends are concerned, she has become a mother again. God grants via Ruth an opportunity for Naomi, having lost those 2 boys, to become a mum again. And is every bit this boy's mum. What a thing that must have felt for her. So much do they see it this way that they say here, verse 17, that their son has been born to Naomi. So there's not just an economic redemption here for them, but it's deeply, deeply personal and emotional. It's not just about the hand-to-mouth survival thing. It's about everything that has been lost, that has been restored. It shows that value, actually, that Naomi serves here in mothering still, but in a different way. And then the community name him here, verse 17. They named him Obed, which means servant, or it could be short for Obadiah, which would mean servant of Yahweh. But either way, we see that the boy here is to serve her, and he's to serve the purposes of Yahweh. And then finally, we see this unforeseen legacy here in this genealogy. Genealogies always tell a story in the Bible here. And the question I think that's being asked here is, well, was the book really about Ruth and Naomi after all, when we get this genealogy that leads to David? Well, yes and no. It was both very much about Ruth and Naomi and that one family and that situation. And yet it was also very much about what God was doing in the whole nation and what God was doing much further into the future than any of them could have possibly foreseen. Ruth has begun with a famine in the land. And we know from the book of Judges just before it that that was usually a sign of God's judgment, usually a sign of God's judgment upon the people's faithlessness. And that's been answered. We've seen that famine relieved and food restored, and they're flourishing economically, at least for this time. And that's why Naomi and Ruth have wound up going back to Bethlehem. But there hasn't been an answer to the real key problem that Judges offered. And it puts it in two different ways. The first way is that you see this constant cycle throughout the book of Judges, this cycle of God's people falling into sin, God's people facing God's judgment, God's people then appealing to God for grace and for mercy and deliverance, God then graciously bringing a human redeemer to come and to deliver them, and then the people turning in repentance. And then eventually, when enough time passes, the cycle begins again. And the book of Judges ended really with the question of saying, well, when are we going to finally have a good, a godly, a righteous leader who is going to lead us into prosperity and righteousness and flourishing and isn't going to fail us and isn't going to die on us? So Judges kept telling us numerous times through it, there was no king in these days. It's a way of pointing to that need. There was no such person really to fill that need. And yet now we know from this genealogy, a king is coming. The great need of deliverance and salvation in the book of Judges is now being answered through the birth of Obed and eventually through the birth and coming of David, a good king. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The king was just 3 generations from complete ruin. The characters couldn't have known the significance of the birth of Obed for the nation or for the purposes of God, but it rekindles a regular narrative that will sort of occur through Scripture of redemption through a miracle child. We've seen it before through Isaac. We see it here with Obed. We'll see it with, we've seen it with Samson. We'll see it with Samuel, and we'll ultimately see it with Jesus himself. The author, most likely writing in the days of David and wanting to give a bit of a backstory to where David has come from, can see this. But even the author couldn't see the fullness of this redemption. For actually we go on to read Matthew chapter 1 in Jesus' genealogy of how he is descended from David and from Obed. The miraculous child leads to the Christ child, a legacy of redemption that was simply beyond the imagination. And it's all come from Boaz doing the right thing, even if it may cost him. Doing the right thing of going out and making sure that Ruth was provided for. Doing the right thing of going out and actually presenting it to this other redeemer to give him the opportunity, even though really that's what he wanted. He risks that he may not have gotten to do that, but still that Ruth would be redeemed. Boaz doing the right thing of providing for Ruth and Naomi, of making sure that Elimelech's line did not die out. What a thing, to put aside his own personal pride, to be able to extend the line of another man. What a gracious thing. Doing the right thing, even when it could have hurt him personally. We've seen that in Ruth to Naomi and sticking by her all this time. We've seen it in Naomi by Ruth in the way that she has tried to sort of help cajole this sort of relationship along. We've seen it in Boaz to Ruth, and now we also finally see it as well in Ruth and Boaz to Naomi, in giving her back the chance to be a mother again and in providing for her throughout the future. To sum up the sort of whole book and what we've seen, let me give you just 4 things we see here just as we come to close here. We've seen God's providence is such that all things, even hard things, are under his hand. Nothing is just sort of chance or arbitrary. We've seen that God's redemption is such that he works through the actions and the initiative of humans. We've seen that God works out his plans and his purposes for his kingdom by working in the lives of individuals and families just like this. And we've seen that God's work of redemption has a far bigger effect beyond us than we can often see ourselves. What we find in the story of Ruth and Boaz is the same hope that we have come to experience for ourselves, of a Redeemer who has come for us on our behalf and has given up so many of his own privileges and his own comfort to come to be numbered alongside us, to live a fully human life with all of the realities of that, all of the weaknesses and frailties and struggles and temptations of daily life, that he might give himself up so that we might find new life, a better Boaz, who's redeemed us despite there being nothing that he would really gain from it. No question of the pieces of land that may have swayed his decision-making. Nothing in our hands we've brought, and yet has been willing to give up his hands to nails that we might be saved, that we might be set free. I don't know if you sort of feel the same, but I often feel when you think of all that Jesus has done, that sometimes it's hard to, understand all of that. But sometimes it's hard to accept. Sometimes it's hard to think that he would love us that much, and hard to really embrace actually walking in it. It's almost as if you want to sort of keep handing the gift back to him, saying, I just don't deserve this. And so I close with another Jane Austen quote, just to prove that, I do read and watch other things, just sort of gangster films. From Pride and Prejudice, one of the characters says, I must learn to be content with being happier than I deserve. And I wonder if we might be able to identify with that and say that we too must learn to be content with being far happier than we may deserve, because that is what God has for us. Let me pray for us, and then Aileen's going to lead us in a closing song together. Father God, I thank you for your grace and your mercy and your love towards us. Lord, we bring nothing in our hands that could possibly sway you or make you feel like you have to love us. There's nothing about us that is, truly speaking, lovely to you. And yet you have chosen in your grace and your mercy and your compassion to love us, and to love us in a way that is just so far beyond our understanding and comprehension at times, Lord, because we all know in human life that love does depend on things. At times we tend to love those who are most lovely. We tend to love those who are nicest to us and closest to us. We tend to find it harder to love those who do things against us. And so it's hard for us to comprehend that you would just love us regardless, and that you would love us to this extent. And Lord, we thank you that you do. We thank you that you have sent Jesus to come and to redeem us, and you have redeemed us from Satan, from sin, and from death, and that in you we find new life. Lord, help us, I pray, to learn to be content with your love, to learn to embrace it, to learn to stop trying to constantly give back as if